welcome to our next presenter. This is Karelly Trevizo. I have a typo on our program, I think. And the title of her presentation is Challenging the Ideal Physician-Patient Relationship in the Dynamic Emergency Department Environment. She worked with the mentor, Dr. Mark Cherry.
Hello, as she mentioned, my name is Karelly Trevizo. Good afternoon. And before I actually start my presentation, I would like to give a little advisory. I am going to be talking about a few case studies today, but just so you guys know, the case studies are based off an accumulation number of cases that I've seen in the ER. So it's not going to be anybody specific. I changed a lot of details, so if you think it's familiar, it's definitely not someone you know. Because I extensively went through to make sure that I protected patient confidentiality. And then we also will be talking about some little heavy concepts throughout the presentation today, including stillborn and a patient or a child having a difficult time breathing. So again, little advisory before continuing. So today I would like to invite you to a conversation talking about the challenging, the ideal patient and physician relationship in the dynamic emergency department. So I am very guilty of this. I always, for the longest time, romanticized the relationship between physicians and their patients. I thought that the ideal relationship with the patient and physician was supposed to be the utmost communication and that they should be lifelong buddies, basically. And I believed mistakenly that there has been some sort of destruction in that kind of relationship since the traditional. And Dr. Riley, in his autobiography, actually speaks to that. There has been a transition between traditional medicine to a more specialized version of medicine. So the traditional medicine talks to patients that had physicians that would go on house calls, or they would be lifelong physicians for these specific patients. But that's not really the case any longer. And now we have specialized physicians that we go to. If you have a urinator problem, you end up going to a urologist sometimes instead of going to see your primary care physician. But that's just kind of the environment that it's basically evolved. And Dr. Pellegrino actually speaks to the morality of medicine and how it's basically internalized. But that cuts off any external factors that obviously do affect the patient relationship. And we'll talk about those factors in a second, but both Dr. Pellegrino and Dr. Riley basically conclude that there has been a devastation within this relationship. But by having a more dynamic relationship with patients, it could be something for the better. So things that actually do affect the patient relationships, or patient-physician relationships, are stuff like informed consent and the physician responsibilities and standards of practice that patient or physicians have, which is actually built upon their field themselves rather than being standardized among a whole thing, just because medicine is an evolving field. It grows. Every year we are overcoming obstacles and we're coming across new ones. So every year the physicians are kind of powering through and making a new version of medicine within their field. Then we have the autonomy that patients have, but as well as physicians, but we can actually get into that a little bit later. And of course the patient health, big part of the relationship that they have, kind of crazy. So these are four models that Edmund has provided for us in 1992. It basically discusses the four types of relationships that patients may have with physicians. The first being the formative model, where the patient has a set of standards and morality that is very defined. They have their distinct own moralities that they don't need any education from physicians based on that. And basically they use physicians as a technical expertise. They want the information just because patients don't typically have the medical expertise that physicians do. So they're using them as a resource to further gain or control their healthcare plan. Then we have the interpretive model, which is kind of a little more back and flow between the patients and physicians. Instead of one dominant domineering over the other. Basically, you actually see this more in traditional medicine, where the patients have a longer relationship with the physicians, and the physicians are able to help guide patients with what they define their moralities and their ethics within the field to be. That kind of guides their medical plan in general. So it's the physician helping the patient realize their own needs. Then we have the deliberative model, which has the patient more open to being taught moralities. And so the physician actually kind of takes a stance as a teacher, as a provider in that sense. And then we have a more paternalistic type of model, where the patient and physician end up having similar or assume similar values, and that way the physician can provide the information that they need, and act as a guardian in that case, and basically take over the decisions that are needed to be made within their healthcare plan. So sorry, that was a lot to get through. So add on top of all of that, emergency medicine. So it kind of throws a wrench into things, just because emergency medicine isn't actually just emergencies. Emergency medicine physicians end up being neurologists and OBGYNs, and they end up doing mini surgeries. So it's a very dynamic field. But before we get into the dynamic aspect, we should look into or inspect what physicians themselves define the field to be, just because, as stated before, the physicians are actually what create the standards of medicine every year. So obviously, if we want to ask them, we should look at what they have to say. So I gathered some associations and societies that emergency medical professionals are a part of, and they basically, save you the reading, they basically all agree that the care of patients basically are all in emergent states. They are taking care of emergencies. Unfortunately for us, we may not have the medical expertise to be able to define what an emergent state is. So that leads me to my first case study. So we have an 8-year-old female that's reporting to the emergency department for some flu-like symptoms, including a cough, fever, some chills, and maybe some fatigue. But whenever she arrives at the emergency department, she begins to be sluggish, not responsive to her surroundings, and upon inspection, you find that she has blue lips, blue fingertips, a very thready, weak pulse, and she has dry lips. So if you have this patient in front of you, I guarantee any of you would call 911, just because that is the type of patient that you would immediately identify as an emergent. You wouldn't know what to do in that case. That might not be as obvious in this next case study, which has a similar concept. This is a 4-year-old that arrives to the emergency department complaining of shortness of breath. The mother notes that the patient began to have a barking cough 2 days ago, and right before arriving at the emergency department, the patient suddenly woke up with this sensation of not being able to breathe. And of course, any parents would do what, if they didn't know what the case was, they would immediately take them to the ER just to make sure that everything was okay. And fortunately, a lot of cases that present like this end up being a more trivial case of croup. Of course, there are very many complications that can happen with croup, including if the patient has an initial medical history of asthma. But many cases, it ends up just being a non-emergent version of it. So if this patient were to arrive after the official diagnosis, it would no longer be an emergent case. But obviously the parents don't really have the knowledge. So that kind of introduces us into our first category of non-emergent patients in the emergency department. The first category is talking about patients that lack the knowledge to be able to determine whether something is an emergent case or not. And that presents itself pretty frequently. We have patients that come in with chest pain, and obviously you would never turn away a chest pain because that could have very severe consequences. I mean, most likely it'll end up being like gastric reflux, but you still don't want to turn them away. You want to make sure that everything's safe. And the patient may not have the ability to discern that prior to going to the ER. We then have our second category, which includes non-life-threatening situations that would suggest an appropriate amount of time to take care of for treatment. So let's say you have a minor fracture or a small laceration. Not something that you have to go to the ER just because of the emergent care, but maybe you didn't get to schedule an appointment to the clinic right away. And of course you don't want to be bleeding out, or you don't want to start having an infection just because you didn't take care of your wound. That's the type of patient that would end up going to the ER as well. And then last category for non-emergent patients are those who don't actually have an emergent case, nor do they need immediate treatment, but maybe they don't have any other, but they are seeking immediate treatment or immediate care. And that is typically because they have no other access to a clinic. They may not be able to afford going somewhere else, or maybe it's the middle of the night. Maybe they had a cough and just wanted to make sure that they could breathe for the rest of the night. So those are obviously non-emergent cases, but they do present themselves in the ER, and they kind of challenge what the emergency physicians have defined ER to stand for. And that brings us to this triage to make sure we don't end up taking care of a cough patient before we do a cardiac arrest. So we would end up going down the list to be able to identify, and this is the Emergency Severity Index created or presented in 2012. And we would go down the list. So for example, if we had case study number 1, we wouldn't necessarily determine whether it's a life-saving treatment, an intervention, but it would be considered a lethargic patient, and they would be in severe distress. So that would make it into a number 2 type patient for triage. But our second case, where the patient didn't need a life-saving intervention, and they didn't hit any of these marks, they would need a number of resources to make sure that they had correct amount, or they were able to breathe thoroughly and make sure they didn't have any of those symptoms, distressing symptoms. So they would just make sure that their vital signs were okay, typically are okay during these group cases, and they would end up being a number 3. So that's kind of taking you step by step on how these cases are looked at in the ER. So of course, this has an effect on on the actual factors of what we consider for the relationship between physicians and patients. We have, again, the informed consent. Patient might not be able to give informed consent if they are unconscious after arriving from a motor vehicle collision. So that might not necessarily be the primary focus. But if a patient was just walking in, they would be able to provide that communication. So there's also these standard practices that I discussed before. These are still evolving, and obviously we do have the challenges that non-emergent patients are coming into what emergency physicians are claiming to be reserved for only emergent patients. So there is that kind of clash here, and that does affect the relationship, but that doesn't have to be necessarily in a negative way. And then we also have the autonomy between patients that many people do want to defend, and of course that is very important whenever considering that relationship, but we should also consider the physician autonomy. If they have values that are contrasting the patient autonomy, the patient values, then that might need more work between the patient and the physician, or they might need to be transferred to another doctor. That just ends up being a case-by-case thing. And then, of course, patient health, which kind of starts the dynamic in the first place. So, going back to the different types of relationships that patients have, we can see most of these cases in the ER. For example, paternalistic. If a patient came in, could not speak for themselves, they were completely unconscious, and they weren't breathing very well. The patient or the physician would immediately start treatment without having that informed consent, and it would take as a paternalistic type of approach. Then we have a more informative type of relationship, and that could present itself as if somebody came in with a cough. They knew that they needed antibiotics, but they just wanted the information from the doctor to make sure they had the right antibiotics and that they can get that prescription. And that's a done deal for them. Interpretive doesn't happen as much in the emergency department, but deliberative actually happens more often than you would think, and that leads me to my final case study. So we have a 37-year-old female who is 17 weeks pregnant. She comes in with severe cramping and vaginal bleeding. This is her first pregnancy, and she's incredibly anxious about the viability of her child. Throughout her stay, she gets more intense contractions and a greater frequency, and the viability for a baby or for a child is at 20 weeks. So it's most likely not going to survive. So this presents a very difficult case for the patient, both the patients and the physician, as well as another life in their hands. So whenever this happens, it immediately becomes paternalistic because the patient comes in with their full autonomy and presents themselves and is asking to save life for them. So the doctor takes over, actually the entire staff takes over. It's orchestrated chaos. Everybody is yelling orders to each other, everybody is communicating with each other, and there seems to be less communication to the patient. Of course, to update her, to make sure she kind of knows what's going on, that they're doing their best to save her, and to save, in general, the situation. But it does take a very paternalistic role. But not only that, there's also the deliberative role that takes place. The patient has extreme emotional distress at this time, and she's asking the doctor what she did wrong, what can they do, what's going to happen. And the physician, while stabilizing her, takes the time out of her day to make sure that the patient has time and is being addressed with these emotional needs. That is a combination that takes place that would further make the dynamic between patients and the relationships a more effective relationship.
We have a few minutes for questions, if anybody has questions.
So I got to ask the first one.
Okay.
So part of what you described was this sort of romanticized version of the physician-patient relationship that this individual needs to work with the whole life. But as part of what happens in ER docs are routinely just seeing this patient this time really fast.
Right.
And they have to really work hard to take care of this patient right now. So the old-fashioned model just doesn't fit, right? So as you describe that, as you and I talk all year, and I pushed you to go do this research and have research that. The question I always like to ask is, in doing all of that, what was the most interesting and unexpected thing you bumped into? Because when you do research, like I do research, you find stuff you didn't anticipate finding. What did you think was most interesting or most unexpected?
I would consider going back into my, personal history rather than the research specifically. I realized that there can be long-term relationships that ER physicians hold with patients, just because if a patient comes in consistently enough with the same type of issue but cannot go anywhere else, you end up being their primary care physician. And that just kind of gives to tell what kind of system we're working with here, and how a lot of patients, actually a really good amount of patients end up having to deal with those situations. So that's something that I found interesting.
So I forgot what you termed the one where the patient lacks the knowledge, and so the doctor essentially makes a decision for them?
Yes, here. Okay. The informative?
Yes. So would you argue that most of the cases in the ER are interpretive?
Not necessarily, because maybe somebody comes in with an abdominal pain. They want the abdominal pain to stop, but they they typically don't know what the options are. But let's say if somebody comes in, and this happens more in a consumer type of environment, including the United States, where pharmaceutical companies can directly advertise to people or to the public. Maybe somebody comes in and demands a specific medication or something along those lines. So that's also something that kind of aligns with informative as well. So, yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned physicians stay out paternalistic, but I was wondering, does that go against patient autonomy?
Good question. So basically, patient autonomy doesn't necessarily cancel out the paternalism. Like I mentioned in the last case study, actually, the patient came in fully autonomous, wanting the care that the physician would provide. And the paternity in that relationship comes in whenever the physician, knowing full well what is best for the patient's health, comes in and steps in and basically takes care of it, and without much decision-making with the patients. They're not going step by step and telling them exactly everything that's going on or what treatments are being given or why. Many times patients are being given medications like out the wazoo and they don't know what medications are. They just know that it's helping save their lives.
Well, given the emergence of heavily automated and technological advances in the medical industry, do you think that's, or like what role would that play in the future in terms of the physician and patient relationship?
I know there are some like websites that you can go to now or apps where you can talk to or like just plug in your symptoms, and apparently someone over the web can just like diagnose you and give you a prescription. I think that's a little shady, to be completely honest, but maybe that's just me thinking in a traditional sense of medicine. Maybe that is a step towards the future, and that's something that we would all benefit from. I think there should be a little more moderation, but I think it could be a possible good step in the future. Any other questions?
I think Dr. Cherry will now bestow your stole.
So as I said previously, one of the great joys of being a professor is having wonderful students, right? And we argued all year. It was great fun, right? I learned a great deal from the arguments and discussions and continuing the research, and it's just been my honor to work with you this year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.